Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The room was silent. So still, it felt as though time itself had come to a halt. The only sound that could be heard was the faint, trembling breath of the woman standing at the center of the crowded hall. Her hands shook, fingers gripping the worn, broken violin in front of her. It was an odd sight, one that would make most people cringe: a violin, its body cracked and barely held together by tape, its strings frayed to the point of snapping. But there she was, poised as if it were the finest instrument in the world, ready to play. The audience had been laughing moments before, murmuring under their breath about the absurdity of it all. How could anyone take this seriously? A broken violin? Who even let her on the stage? The murmurs had grown louder as she walked onto the stage, her presence stark against the polished, professional performers that had come before her. She didn't seem to care. With each step, her shoes clicked softly against the wooden floor, but her gaze remained locked ahead, her posture straight and unyielding. The crowd watched her skeptically, most of them already dismissing her as someone who didn't belong in such a prestigious setting. It was supposed to be an evening of fine art, a celebration of skill, grace, and beauty. But here she stood, with an instrument that looked as though it had seen better days. The judges exchanged glances, their expressions barely masked. One even raised an eyebrow, but the woman gave no sign of acknowledging them. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, her breath a little unsteady now. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the judgment in every second that passed, but she stayed focused. This was her moment. As she drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the noise of the crowd faded. The room seemed to hold its breath. The sound that emerged was raw, jagged, imperfect. But something about it, something about that one note, left everyone in the room paralyzed. It wasn't the sound of a broken instrument. It wasn't the sound of an unskilled player. It was something much more complicated. It was the sound of years of struggle, of heartache, and of a story that no one had expected. It was the sound of defiance. She played the second note, a little more steady now, and the crowd shifted. There was something in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that none of them could explain. This wasn't just any music. It wasn't just the plucking of strings. It was like the sound reached deep into the hearts of every listener, stirring emotions they hadn't anticipated. The violin had been broken, but in that moment, the woman wasn't. She played with a rawness, an emotion that transcended technical skill. The crowd began to listen. At first, it was a trickle. Then, it was a flood. The notes started to flow, the music weaving through the hall like an unseen thread, pulling the audience into its grip. Each note seemed to tell a story. Each note seemed to ask a question. Why was she here? What was she trying to prove? And most of all, who was she? Her eyes remained closed, her body swaying slightly with the music, lost in her own world. She didn't need to see the faces of the people who had doubted her. She didn't need to hear the whispers that had followed her every step. All that mattered now was the music, and the pain and beauty that flowed from it. As the final note echoed through the hall, there was a brief moment of complete silence. No one dared to move. The sound of her broken violin had shaken them, left them breathless, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Then, it came. A single gasp, barely audible, but it spread like wildfire through the crowd. And then the applause started, tentative at first, then growing louder, like a storm breaking. They had been expecting failure. They had been expecting disappointment. Instead, they had witnessed something far greater. Something unexplainable. A woman, with a broken violin, had just given them an experience they would never forget. But the woman, she remained still. She didn't take a bow. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply lowered the violin, her eyes still closed, as if she were lost in the sound that lingered in the air. A part of her was still there, caught in the music. And that was when they realized, this was not just a performance. It was a cry for help. It was a story waiting to be told. What was the true story behind the woman with the broken violin? What had driven her to perform in such a state, with such passion? And most importantly, why did her first note leave everyone silent? The applause didn't last long. In fact, it felt almost awkward after the stunning silence that had followed her final note. The crowd, once filled with doubt, had turned into an ocean of whispers. Each person seemed to be asking the same question: who was she? But she didn't care. In the corner of the hall, backstage, she sat alone, her hands gripping the broken violin as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. The noise from the crowd filtered through the thin walls, but she could hardly hear it. She was still trapped in the moment, in the music, in the way the sound had felt as it left her and vibrated through the hall. It was everything she had needed to say. Everything she had been too scared to say for so long. Her fingers gently traced the cracks along the side of the violin, the lines and breaks that mirrored her own life. She had been told it was useless, just like the instrument in her hands. She had been told that nothing good could come from something so damaged, something so broken. But in that moment on stage, she had proven them wrong. A knock on the door broke her reverie. She quickly wiped her face, unsure of when the tears had started to fall. There had been no audience to see her weakness, but now, in the solitude, it was all she could do to keep herself from breaking down completely. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse, her throat tight from holding back everything she had felt. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was the head judge, a man with graying hair and a face that had seen many years of concerts and performances. He was one of the most respected musicians in the world, and she had known that from the moment she walked on stage. He was the one who had raised an eyebrow earlier, the one who had looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and pity. She didn't know what to expect from him now. He closed the door behind him and took a step forward, his gaze still intense but softened by something else, something she couldn't place. That was, he paused, looking for the right words. That was unexpected. She said nothing, her eyes trained on the violin in her hands, unwilling to look up at him. "You were supposed to be a joke," he continued, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "That was what everyone thought. That you wouldn't even make it past the first note." She finally looked up at him, her eyes sharp, but there was something in them, something more than anger. "But you did. You played that violin as if your life depended on it." Her heart skipped a beat. That was exactly it. It had been her life. The music had been her way out, her escape from a reality that had always been too heavy to bear. But no one could know that. No one could understand the weight she carried. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one does." The judge's expression softened further, as if he sensed the depth of her pain, the complexity of the story she hadn't told yet. He sat down across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're right," he said. "I don't understand. But I can tell that you've been through something that most people would never survive." She felt a strange sensation in her chest, a knot of fear and recognition. For a brief moment, she thought about the woman she used to be. The girl who had been terrified of speaking out, of telling anyone what she had been through. The woman who had been silenced by the world around her. "I've had to fight for everything," she said, her voice steadier now, but still tinged with emotion. "I've had to fight for a place in this world. I've had to fight to be heard." The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And you think playing that broken violin was your way of being heard?" She smiled bitterly. "No. It was my way of being seen. To show everyone that I'm still here. That I'm still standing." There was a long silence between them. The kind of silence that filled the room with more questions than answers. The kind of silence that made everything she had been hiding feel just a little too real. "You're not the first person to face adversity," the judge said, his tone measured, but his eyes full of something else. "But most people don't have the courage to do what you did. To stand in front of everyone, knowing they're expecting failure, and still go through with it. That takes strength. It takes heart." The words lingered in the air, and she felt herself unraveling just a little bit more. She hadn't done it for the applause. She hadn't done it to prove anyone wrong. She had done it for herself. She had done it to remind herself that she was alive, that she had a voice, that she still had something to say. "But I didn't play the violin to show off," she added, her voice low. "I didn't do it to prove anything to anyone. I did it because it was the only thing left in me. The only thing I had left." The judge's gaze softened even more, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something like understanding in his eyes. Something that made her feel a little less alone. "What happened to you?" he asked gently, his voice barely audible. The question was simple, but it hit her like a ton of bricks. She had never asked herself that question, not in those words. She had never allowed herself to go back and face what had happened. She had buried it all so deep that even now, with the weight of it pressing against her chest, she couldn't find the courage to speak. But he was waiting for her answer. She exhaled shakily, her hands tightening around the violin. She couldn't speak about it, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she could tell him the one thing that had kept her going all this time. "I used to believe that I could overcome anything," she whispered. "But sometimes, life doesn't let you win. And sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you still lose." The words hung in the air between them. The judge said nothing. He didn't need to. She could see that he understood. But as she sat there, with the broken violin in her hands, she realized something. Maybe this was just the beginning. Maybe the music, the broken instrument, and the performance were just the first steps on a much longer journey. A journey that she wasn't sure she was ready for, but one that she knew she had to take. And so, the real story began. The hallways backstage were quiet now, with only the sound of soft footsteps echoing off the walls. The performance had ended, but the tension lingered, thick in the air like an unspoken promise. She sat in a corner, clutching the broken violin in her lap. Her heart still raced from the adrenaline, her fingers numb from the pressure she had put on them to hold the bow steady. But beneath that, there was a strange sense of calm. The storm within her had not yet passed, but she had taken the first step toward something. Toward herself. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment before she walked on stage. The room had been filled with laughter and judgment. The air thick with the disbelief that anyone could take her seriously. But it hadn't always been like that. No, once upon a time, there had been a spark of hope in her life. Once, she had been just like everyone else, innocent, carefree, and unafraid to dream. That was before everything changed. She closed her eyes, the images flooding her mind like they always did when she tried to remember the past. They weren't perfect memories, in fact, some of them were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered puzzle. But they were hers. She was just a little girl when her life took its first real turn. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew each other's name, where the streets were quiet, and the houses were lined up in neat rows, almost as though they were all part of some perfect plan. It was a place where nothing could go wrong, or so she had thought. Her father had been a man of few words, but his presence was always larger than life. He had a way of making people listen, of making them believe in the impossible. Her mother was different. She was a dreamer, the kind of person who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. And for a while, that was enough. The three of them had lived in harmony, like a family in a storybook. But that was before the accident. The night it happened was etched into her memory, sharper than anything she could recall from before. It had started like any other evening, with her father coming home from work and her mother preparing dinner in the kitchen. The house smelled of warm food and the familiar comfort of family. She had been sitting in the living room, playing with her toys, when the phone rang. She had never forgotten the sound of her mother's voice when she picked up the receiver. The panic in her mother's voice was something she had never heard before. It was a sound that would haunt her for years. "Hello?" her mother had asked, the line crackling with static. "Yes, this is Mrs. Thompson." Her mother's face had gone pale, and she had dropped the phone, her hand trembling. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, and yet, they passed in the blink of an eye. Her father had been in a car accident. He had been hit by a drunk driver on his way home. The world had stopped turning for her mother, and for a moment, it had stopped turning for her too. The only thing she remembered after that night was the hospital, the sterile, cold hallways, the beeping of machines, and the hushed whispers from the doctors. Her father didn't make it. The aftermath had been brutal. Her mother had changed. The once vibrant, dream-filled woman was now hollow. She no longer believed in happy endings or fairy tales. The woman who had once talked about love, it was as if she had disappeared into a dark pit from which she could never escape. But even as she withdrew, there was one thing that stayed constant in her life: her violin. Her father had been the one who had first introduced her to music. He had believed in it, believed in her. "You have a gift," he'd told her. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do it." It was his voice she heard when she held the violin in her hands, his encouragement that pushed her to keep playing even when everything seemed impossible. But when her father died, the violin became her only escape. It was the only piece of him that remained. The only piece that made her feel like he was still with her, guiding her. So she played. She played through the nights when her mother would cry herself to sleep. She played when the silence was too much to bear. She played until her fingers bled, until the music was the only thing that made sense in a world that had turned upside down. But even music couldn't save her mother. Even the beautiful sounds of the violin couldn't bring her back to life. And soon, the violin became more of a curse than a gift. Her mother began to resent the instrument. It was as though the music reminded her of everything she had lost, everything she could never get back. "Stop playing that thing," her mother would scream. "It's all your father's fault. If he hadn't been so obsessed with his damn music." The words cut deep, deeper than she had ever let anyone see. But she kept playing, because playing was the only thing that helped her keep her grip on reality. She had no one else to turn to. Her mother's mental state continued to worsen, and eventually, her grandmother came to take care of them. That was when they moved to the city. The small town had held too many memories, too much pain. It was a fresh start, a new chapter. Or so her grandmother had said. But nothing could ever really be new when the past was always lurking, always present in the form of silent nights and broken dreams. In the city, things were different. The noise, the crowds, the hustle and bustle, they were all so foreign to her. But it was here, in this unfamiliar place, that she found herself in a situation that would forever change her life. It wasn't long before she found a new school, a place where she could start fresh. But the world hadn't forgotten her. The world never forgot. She was still the girl with the broken violin, the girl with the sad eyes. The other kids noticed her. They whispered behind her back, called her, the one who said she was too weird for anyone to like. He smirked as he came closer, his friends in tow. "Hey, loser," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Are you really going to keep playing that thing? You're never going to be good enough. You're just a joke." Her heart raced. She wanted to fight back, to tell him that he didn't know anything about her, that he couldn't possibly understand. But instead, she clutched the violin case tighter and ran. She ran all the way home, her tears blurring her vision. It wasn't until she was safe inside her room, the door locked behind her, that she allowed herself to cry. She had become so used to the judgment, so accustomed to the pain, that it no longer hurt as much as it used to. But that didn't make it any easier. The violin, once her father's gift, had become her curse. The one thing she had that connected her to him had become the thing that set her apart from the rest of the world. And so, as the years passed, she had kept the violin hidden, playing only in secret, never letting anyone hear. She had become someone else. She had become someone who didn't believe in dreams anymore, someone who had long ago given up on the possibility of hope. Until tonight. Until she walked onto that stage with the broken violin in her hands, and for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to be seen. To be heard. She had taken that step, and there was no turning back now. The sun had barely risen when she left her apartment the next morning. The performance still lingered in her mind, like the echo of a song that had long since faded away. The applause was nothing more than a distant memory now. It was a fleeting moment of validation, a tiny victory in a life filled with losses. Her mind kept returning to the same question: what now? What did she do after everything she had been through? After all the struggle, the silence, and the years of hiding, she had finally stood on that stage. But had it really been enough? She walked briskly down the street, her breath visible in the chilly air. People bustled around her, hurrying toward their destinations, lost in their own worlds. She was just another face in the crowd, another forgotten person walking through life without anyone noticing. But then there was the violin. The violin, which had been her anchor, her escape, had also become her symbol. And it was the one thing she couldn't seem to shake. She couldn't explain why it meant so much to her. It wasn't just the music. It was the connection it had to her father, to the life she had lost. It was the one thing that had kept her grounded when everything else seemed to fall apart. She had told no one about her performance the night before. Not her grandmother, not her few close friends. To be seen, but was it enough to change anything? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her train of thought. She pulled it out, seeing a message from the judge. It had been sent late the previous night. "I know you're probably still processing everything, but I think you should come by the studio today. I want to talk to you about your performance." Her stomach fluttered, a mixture of nerves and curiosity flooding her body. Why was he reaching out? What did he want from her? She had barely spoken to him after the performance, and now he was asking her to come by his studio? A wave of self-doubt crept in. Maybe he had only been trying to be kind, maybe the performance hadn't been as impactful as she had thought. Maybe it had been nothing more than an emotional outburst, a fluke, and now the judge was just trying to soften the blow. But despite the doubts swirling in her mind, she couldn't ignore the pull to go. There was something inside her that said this was important, something telling her that she couldn't walk away from this moment. So, she decided to go. The studio was tucked away on a quiet street in the arts district. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a small, unassuming building with an old sign hanging crookedly above the door. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt the weight of its history. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past performances, accolades, and portraits of musicians who had come and gone. There was an air of reverence here, a respect for the craft that she hadn't felt in years. The judge was waiting for her, seated behind a large desk cluttered with sheet music and instruments. He was as composed as ever, but there was something different in his eyes now, something more intense. "Come in, please," he said, motioning to a chair across from him. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity. She sat down slowly, keeping her hands tightly clasped in her lap. She wasn't sure what to expect. She wasn't sure what she was even looking for. "First off, I want to tell you that you left an impression last night," the judge said, leaning forward slightly. "You played in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. There's something raw in your performance. Something that isn't easy to find in today's world of perfection." She didn't know how to respond. She had always been told that her music wasn't good enough, that she would never measure up. The praise felt foreign to her, like a compliment she didn't know how to accept. I know you've been through a lot, he continued. I've seen it in the way you play. The pain, the struggle, it's all there, in the music. It's not just notes and rhythms. It's your life. It's your story. She felt her throat tighten at the mention of her past, her eyes stinging with the memories she had buried for so long. She hadn't expected him to see through the layers, to understand the depth of her pain. But somehow, he had. Why did you play? He asked softly. What made you step onto that stage with a broken violin? The question was simple, yet it felt like a 1,000-ton weight pressing down on her chest. She had been running from her past for so long, trying to hide from it. And yet here it was, staring her in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel the wall she had built around herself starting to crumble. The judge waited patiently, as if giving her the time she needed to find the truth within herself. Finally, she spoke. I played because I needed to remind myself that I was still here, she said quietly. I've spent so long hiding, pretending that I was fine, that I was moving on. But I wasn't. I was just, existing. The violin was the only thing that ever made me feel alive, and it was the only thing that felt like it belonged to me. But I didn't want to be that person anymore, the one who hides behind the music. I wanted to be seen for who I really am. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. And I thought, if I could play that violin, even if it was broken, even if everything else was falling apart, maybe I could show everyone, including myself, that I was still worthy. That I still had something left to give. There was a long silence between them, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had truly said what was in her heart. She had never allowed herself to be that vulnerable before. Not to anyone. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What you did last night was more than just music. It was a message. To yourself, to the world. And it's something that people need to hear. She shook her head. But it's not enough. It wasn't enough to fix everything. It doesn't change the past. No, the judge agreed. It doesn't change the past. But it gives you the chance to move forward. It's a start. And that's all we can ever really ask for, isn't it? A chance to start over. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that hadn't been there before. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Maybe the broken violin wasn't a symbol of failure. Maybe it was a symbol of survival. You're not alone in this, the judge said, his voice gentle. You're not the only one who has had to fight to be seen. And I think you have a chance to do something great with your story. Something bigger than you can imagine right now. She felt a lump form in her throat as she met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that told her that he believed in her. That he saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself for a long time. She had no idea what the city that once felt so cold and unfamiliar had suddenly become the backdrop for something more. She wasn't sure what it was yet, the possibilities were still hazy, like an image just out of reach, but it was something bigger than the life she had lived before. Something that had the potential to change everything. It wasn't the violin itself, not entirely. The instrument still felt like a part of her soul, a broken piece, but still vital. It was the feeling that something had started to shift in her, deep inside. She had played in front of people for the first time in years, and though the music had been imperfect, it had made her feel seen. It had made her feel real. But now, she couldn't shake the overwhelming fear that it wasn't enough. She had been visible for a fleeting moment, but the question that haunted her was, could she stay visible? Could she keep standing in front of the world, knowing how fragile she was? The fear that everyone would see her brokenness again, that she would be reduced to her failures, it was suffocating. Every morning, she found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to find the courage to leave the house. to face the world. Some days were easier than others. Some days, she was able to put on a brave face, gather her thoughts, and step outside into the bustling streets, hoping no one would see the cracks inside her. Other days, the weight of the past was too much. And on those days, she stayed hidden, refusing to allow anyone to see how much she was still struggling. The violin had become both her salvation and her torment. Every time she picked it up, she was reminded of the rawness in her music. Of the vulnerability she had poured into every note. But it also reminded her of the girl she had been, the girl who had hidden in silence, too afraid to speak or to be seen. She still wasn't sure which version of herself she wanted to embrace. It was a late afternoon when she finally decided to face the judge's challenge. He had invited her to visit the studio again, saying he had a proposition for her. Her nerves fluttered at the thought. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about what he had said, that her story, her music, could be something bigger than herself. But the self-doubt still lingered. Could she really make something of it? Could she really share her pain, her journey, with the world? With trembling hands, she grabbed the violin case and left her apartment. This time, her steps felt heavier. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It wasn't just about performing. It was about embracing the parts of herself she had hidden for so long. She didn't know if she was ready to show everyone the person she had become, the person she was still trying to understand. The studio felt different today. The door seemed heavier, the hallway longer. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the judge was waiting, just as he had before, but this time, there was an air of anticipation around him. He was standing by a piano, his fingers lightly tapping against the keys as if waiting for something. "You came," he said, his voice warm but with a hint of something else, something she couldn't quite read. "I came," she replied, her voice steady, but her heart was racing. She set the violin case down on the floor, her hands still shaking from the weight of her decision. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. "Good," the judge said with a nod. "I want to show you something." She raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. He gestured toward the piano, and she could see that he had laid out a few sheets of sheet music on top. Music she hadn't seen before. "I've been working on something," he said. "Something that I think could help you. Something that could take your performance to a new level. But it's not just about the notes or the violin. It's about the message you want to share. The story you want to tell." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to offer her anything more than a kind word or two. But this was different. This was an opportunity, a chance to take the music and make it more than what it had been before. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He slid the sheet music toward her. "This is a composition I've been working on. But it's not just mine anymore. It's yours. It's your story." She stared at the music, her mind racing. This was unexpected. She had never imagined that someone would take the time to write music for her, music that was meant to tell her story. It was overwhelming. This is for me?" she asked, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "Yes," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "It's your chance to take everything you've been through, your pain, your resilience, your journey, and bring it to life in a way that no one else can. You've already shown that you have the power to move people with your music. Now, it's time to show them who you really are." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. She had been running from herself for so long, afraid to show anyone who she truly was. But this was different. This was an invitation to be seen. To be heard. To finally share the pieces of her soul she had kept hidden for so long. She looked at the sheet music again, this time with a sense of purpose. She could do this. She could tell her story, not just through the broken violin, but through the music itself. She could stop hiding and start living. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, steady for the first time in a long while. "I'll play it. I'll make them see me." The following weeks were a blur. The judge worked with her tirelessly, guiding her through the new composition, teaching her how to breathe life into the notes that now belonged to her. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration. Moments when she wanted to throw the violin aside and give up. But each time she felt herself slipping, the judge was there to encourage her, to remind her why she was doing this. And slowly, piece by piece, the music started to come alive. It wasn't just about playing the violin anymore. It was about telling her story, about taking everything she had been through, the pain, the loss, the silence, and transforming it into something beautiful. Something that would make people listen, make them feel. As the days turned into weeks, she began to feel a shift inside her. It wasn't just her music that was changing, it was her. She was beginning to understand that her journey, all the pain, all the mistakes, all the brokenness, wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was what made her who she was. And that, she realized, was something worth sharing. The first rehearsal with the full orchestra was scheduled for the following week. It was a moment she had once thought was out of her reach. A dream she had abandoned long ago. But now, standing on the edge of it, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. She wasn't sure if she was ready. She wasn't sure if anyone could ever truly understand her story. But as she stood in the rehearsal room, the judge at the piano, the musicians around her tuning their instruments, she realized something: it didn't matter if they understood. It only mattered that she was finally telling her truth. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to be seen. The final rehearsal was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The air in the room was electric with anticipation, but it was also heavy with emotion. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It wasn't just about the notes or the perfect execution of a violin solo. It was about her, the woman who had stepped onto that stage months ago with nothing but a broken violin and a heart full of fear. It was about her story, her pain, her resilience. And now, she was ready to tell it. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted the violin, running her fingers over the cracked surface, the familiar weight of it anchoring her. It had been through so much with her. It had witnessed her lowest moments, her fear, her doubt, and now it was going to carry the story of her survival into the world. She could almost hear her father's voice in her mind: "You have a gift. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do it." But now, those words felt different. They didn't feel like the voice of a man long gone. They felt like the voice of someone who had helped her find her true self. The judge had helped her unlock something she didn't even know was there. He had given her the courage to confront her past and transform it into something powerful, something beautiful. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't running away. She was ready to stand tall and embrace who she was. The conductor raised his baton, and the room fell into a hush. The orchestra was ready. They had rehearsed the composition countless times. They knew their parts. And now, it was time. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The weight of the moment felt immense, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. This was what she had been working for. This was her moment. The first note was the hardest. She had known it would be. It was the moment that would determine everything, the moment that would decide whether she could truly step into the world with everything she had, everything she was. But when her bow touched the strings, the music that emerged was not the sound of a broken instrument. It was the sound of survival, of strength, of a woman who had fought to be heard. The music enveloped her, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. It was different now. The rawness that had once terrified her had become her strength. She was no longer playing to prove herself. She was playing to honor everything she had survived, to tell a story that needed to be told. She was playing for the girl who had been afraid, for the woman who had fought to find herself. As the orchestra played behind her, she felt the music move through her, a wave of emotion that built with each note. The music wasn't perfect. It wasn't flawless. But it was real. It was raw. It was the story of her life, the story of a broken girl who had somehow, against all odds, found a way to rise. Every note carried the weight of her journey, the pain of loss, the fear of failure, the longing for acceptance, but also the hope, the strength, and the resilience that had kept her going. The audience was silent. She could feel their eyes on her, but it wasn't the judgment she had feared for so long. It was something else, something deeper. They were listening, truly listening. They could hear the story in her music. They could feel her pain, her hope, her triumph. As the final movement approached, she felt the culmination of everything she had been through. It was as if the music had become her voice, speaking for her in a way she had never been able to before. This was her truth, laid bare for the world to hear. The last note rang out, hanging in the air, a perfect echo of everything she had poured into it. And then, silence. The kind of silence that felt like the world had stopped, like time itself had frozen in place. And then, the applause came. It started softly, almost hesitantly, as if the audience were unsure of what they had just witnessed. But it didn't take long for the applause to grow, to swell into a crescendo that filled the room. It wasn't just polite clapping. It wasn't just a response to a performance. It was a response to the music, to the emotion that had been laid bare for them all to hear. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. Not from doubt. They were shaking because she had finally done it. She had finally told her story. She had finally allowed herself to be seen, to be heard, in a way that was real and true. The tears she had been holding back all these months began to spill down her face, but they were tears of relief, of release. She had been afraid for so long, afraid that if she allowed herself to be seen, people would see only her brokenness. But now, she knew that it wasn't her brokenness that defined her. It was her resilience. It was her strength. The conductor approached her, his expression one of admiration. He didn't speak. There was no need. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder, offering a silent gesture of respect. As she stepped off the stage, the judge was waiting for her backstage, his expression one of quiet pride. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. She had done it. She had faced the fear, the doubt, the pain, and she had come out the other side. "You were incredible," he said finally, his voice soft but filled with meaning. She smiled through her tears, the weight of everything she had been through finally lifting off her shoulders. "Thank you. For everything. You did this yourself," he said. "All I did was show you the way. The rest was up to you." For the first time in a long time, she believed him. The days after the performance were a blur of interviews, praise, and recognition. People from all over came to congratulate her, to tell her how moving her performance had been. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also validating. She had never expected to be the center of attention, but now, she realized that it wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about the fact that she had finally allowed herself to be vulnerable. To be seen. In the months that followed, her music took on a life of its own. She began composing, creating pieces that told the story of her journey, pieces that spoke of pain and healing, of fear and strength. The broken violin, once a symbol of her fractured past, became her tool for creating something beautiful. She traveled, performed, and shared her music with the world, but more importantly, she shared her story. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't have a perfect life. But for the first time, she was at peace with who she was. She had learned that the scars of the past didn't define her. It was how she had fought to survive, how she had learned to rise, that mattered. And when she stood on stage, violin in hand, she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer afraid to be seen.